At 10 p.m. on August 23, 1944, Sergeant Bob Tompkins crouched behind a hedgerow outside Brest, inflating a rubber tank 2 kilometers from German anti-tank positions. He was 27 years old, had taken part in 4 deception missions, and lost 0 tanks. The Germans had 38,000 soldiers defending Fortress Brest. Tompkins hooked the air hose to the collapsed Sherman. The 603rd Camouflage engineers had driven 190 miles through rain that day. No rest, no warm meals, just orders from 8th Corps. Simulate 2 tank battalions. Convinced General Rameke that 30,000 Americans were preparing to assault his right flank. Do it with 100 men and inflatable rubber. The tank began to form, an M4 Sherman, full scale, 93 pounds. A genuine Sherman weighed 33 tons. This one would collapse if anyone leaned on it too firmly. From 800 yards away, German lookouts observed from the church tower in Guesnu. Tompkins had spotted them earlier with binoculars. 2 men, likely artillery observers, probably radioing coordinates at that moment. The Ghost Army didn't carry heavy weapons, no artillery, no armor, just carbines and 50 caliber machine guns. Their fight was with illusion instead. Inflatable tanks that looked authentic from 500 yards. Sound trucks blaring recordings of tank engines and yelling sergeants. Radio teams imitating real units. Artists painting false insignia on jeeps. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had been activated in January. Wanador's 100 men. Average IQ 119. Artists, engineers, actors, draftees. Fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, photographer Art Kane, West Point officers mixed with art school dropouts. They'd landed in France in May, 2 weeks after D-Day. Their first mission, simulate a Mulberry Harbor with lights, divert German artillery from the genuine one. Then came Operation Fortitude. Fabricate an entire army near Pas-de-Calais to make Hitler believe the real invasion was coming there, not Normandy. Each assignment brought them closer to the front, closer to discovery. 3 had already been killed, 30 wounded by shell fire. Now they were at Brest. The mission was critical. Beat! Corps had 3 infantry divisions encircling the port, the 2nd, 8th, and 29th. But Patton needed them for his dash across France. The Ghost Army had to hold the line with phantom forces, while the real divisions withdrew. If the Germans uncovered the ruse and counterattacked, 2,100 lightly armed men wouldn't stand a chance. If you want to see whether Tompkins's rubber tanks truly fooled Hitler's paratroopers, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next was unbelievable. Back to Tompkins. The compressor hissed. 20 minutes per tank. Task Force X required 15 Shermans inflated before dawn. Captain Oscar Seal led the group. 200 men simulating the 15th Tank Battalion. They had 1 authentic tank company from the 709th Tank Battalion as a corps. The rest was smoke and mirrors. Tompkins checked his watch. Aero 2:30, just 3.5 hours till sunrise. 11 tanks to go. At 06 round, German reconnaissance planes would sweep overhead. Luftwaffe pilots with cameras. If the tanks appeared fake from the sky, the whole ruse was over. If they looked real, German artillery would rain fire. 80 mm shells. High explosives. Private James Anderson, a mechanic from Virginia, helped position the next tank, carving fake tracks with a bulldozer to suggest dozens of Shermans had rolled through. The air pump jammed. Tompkins fixed it and started again. The rubber Sherman slowly expanded. Turret, hull, tracks. From up close, it looked absurd. From 800 yards through German binoculars, menacing, by Oro 3.0, they'd finished 13 tanks. Anderson continued making track marks while others hung camouflage netting, making it appear that crews slept nearby. The sound truck arrived at Oro 3:30, blasting vinyl recordings, tank engines, shouting NCOs, Loud enough for German listening posts to hear, but not so loud as to seem staged, dawn broke at 06:12. The Luftwaffe recon plane appeared at 06:47, circling twice, cameras snapping, then vanished. By noon, 19th Corps intelligence intercepted German radio chatter. They were repositioning 20 to 50 anti-tank guns. The deception had succeeded. But now those guns were aimed straight at Tompkins and his rubber army. 6 months earlier, on January 20th, 1944, the Ghost Army had been nothing more than a concept in a London office. Major Ralph Ingersoll studied recon photos from North Africa. British deception tactics against Rommel. Dummy tanks, fake depots, sound tricks. The Desert Fox had been fooled. Ingersoll showed them to Colonel Billy Harris. "We need this for Normandy." The challenge was scale. The Allies were planning the largest amphibious assault in history. D-Day, 150,000 men across 5 beaches. But Hitler had 50 divisions in France, waiting. If they discovered where and when, the invasion would fail. Deception wasn't new. George Washington had used it at Trenton, but the U.S. Army had never formed a dedicated tactical deception unit. No manuals, no doctrine, no gear. They were inventing it from nothing. Harris got approval in early January. Create a special troops unit with one mission. Mislead the enemy about Allied numbers and movements. Save lives through illusion. The first obstacle was personnel. Combat troops knew how to fight. Engineers knew how to build. But who could lie convincingly on a battlefield? Harris needed creative thinkers, artists who grasped perspective and light, sound men who could forge audio, radio specialists who could replicate real transmissions, actors who could perform under fire. Recruitment began in late January. They pulled from existing units, the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the 244th Signal Company, and new recruits with unusual talents. Fashion designers, painters, photographers, set builders from Broadway. The unit's average IQ was 119, higher than most infantry divisions. Colonel Harry Rear took command, former commander of the 46th Armored Infantry Regiment. Rear had studied tactical innovation, but even he was walking blind. There was almost no literature on battlefield deception. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simpson developed the training at Camp Forest, Tennessee. How to inflate a dummy tank in 20 minutes. How to create fake radio traffic that sounded real. How to paint unit insignia that would fool a reconnaissance. How to act like a different division entirely. The equipment arrived in February. Inflatable tanks from Goodyear. Each one weighed under 100 lb. Could be carried by 4 men. Inflated with portable air compressors. From 500 yards, they looked real. From 50 yards, they looked absurd. The sound equipment was experimental. Mobile trucks with speakers that could project audio 15 auf Benim. Vinyl recordings off tank columns. Artillery fire, troop movements, played at night when German listening posts were active. The third component was radio deception. The signal company would mimic entire divisions. Copy the communication patterns of real units. Use the same call signs, same procedures, same operator quirks. Make German intelligence think they were tracking actual combat divisions. By April, the unit was ready. 1,100 men, 4 subunits. 603rd Camouflage Engineers for visual deception. Signal Company Special for radio deception. 406th Combat Engineers for security. Sonic Company for audio deception. But ready for what exactly? The officers didn't know if it would work. British deception in North Africa had succeeded against Rommel. But that was desert warfare, open terrain, long sight lines. Normandy would be different. Hedros, villages, Germans who'd been preparing defenses for 4 years. The advanced party flew to England on April 10th. Reader and 6 officers. Their job, figure out how to integrate deception into the invasion plan. They had less than 2 months until D-Day. The main force sailed on the USS Henry Gibbons in early May, 13 days crossing the Atlantic. They arrived in Bristol on May 15th. 2 weeks before the invasion, Operation Fortitude was already underway. The British were running a massive deception. Fake army groups, phantom divisions, all designed to convince Hitler the invasion would hit Padal, not Normandy. The Ghost Army would support it, but Rear faced a critical problem. His men had trained in Tennessee. Controlled conditions, no enemy, no live fire. Now they'd be operating within artillery range of German guns. If the deception looked fake, the operation failed. If it looked too real, the Germans would attack, and 1,100 men with light weapons couldn't hold against a determined assault. Reader needed to know, could his rubber army survive contact with the enemy? On June 6, 1944, at 06:30 a.m., the Allies hit Normandy beaches. The Ghost Army wasn't there. They were still in England, waiting, frustrated. While real soldiers died on Omaha and Utah, the deceivers sat in Stratford upon Avon, inflating practice tanks. 2 weeks later, on June 21st, the first Ghost Army detachment crossed the Channel. 20 men, one mission. Simulate a Mulberry Harbor at night with lights. Draw German artillery away from the real artificial harbors at Aramos. It almost worked too well. So many Allied lights already illuminated the coast that the Ghost Army's contribution was insignificant. But it taught them something critical. German artillery spotters were watching, calculating, waiting for targets. The full unit arrived in France on June 23rd. They bivouacked near the beaches. The smell of cordite still hung in the air. Burned-out tanks littered the hedge. This wasn't Tennessee anymore. Their first real test came in July. Operation Brittany. Patton's Third Army was racing east across France. But the Germans didn't know where. East across France. But the Germans didn't know where. 4 divisions, multiple directions, impossible to track. The Ghost Army would create confusion. They split into 4 task forces, each one simulating a combat team from a different division. 35th Infantry, 80th Infantry, 90th Infantry, 2nd Armored. The plan was elegant. Real divisions would keep moving east, while fake divisions turned west and south into Brittany. Each task force was complete. Fake bumper markings, fake shoulder patches, fake radio traffic. Men visited cafes wearing the wrong division insignia, started conversations. Let slip false information. Hoped someone listening was reporting to German intelligence. Captain George Rebbe commanded the security element. His job was to protect the deception, keep real American units from discovering what they were doing, because if their own army didn't know, the Germans wouldn't either. The operation ran from August 9th through August 12th, 4 days of theater. Radio operators mimicked division-level communications. Sound trucks broadcast recorded troop movements. Artists painted unit markings on every vehicle. German intelligence intercepted the radio traffic. Reported 4 American combat teams heading into Brittany. Hitler's commanders repositioned forces to counter the threat. Real American divisions slipped past and continued east. By the time the Germans realized the Brittany columns were fake, Patton was already approaching Paris. But success created a new problem. Higher command now believed the Ghost Army could do anything. Every corps commander wanted them. Every operation needed deception support. The requests poured in. Most were impossible. Deception required time, planning, coordination. You couldn't just inflate tanks and hope the Germans noticed. Everything had to be perfect. Radio operators had to match real unit patterns exactly. Sound effects had to be played at precise volumes. Visual displays had to account for German observation posts and aerial reconnaissance. One mistake would expose them, and exposure meant death. Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Day learned this at Brest. He'd volunteered to establish radio contact with approaching notional columns, drove into the city while it was still under German fire, helped capture 300 German soldiers, earned a Bronze Star. But he also saw what would happen if the Ghost Army's position was discovered. Artillery would obliterate them in minutes. The men started understanding the stakes. They weren't combat troops, but they were in combat. Every operation brought them closer to German guns. Every deception required them to draw enemy attention. Private James Anderson wrote in his diary, "We're bait." He was right. The Ghost Army's job was to look dangerous, make the Germans commit resources to counter a threat that didn't exist. But to look dangerous, they had to position themselves where the Germans could see them. Forward observation posts, artillery range, sniper distance. The officers tried to minimize risk, posted guards, kept exits clear, never stayed in one position too long, but there was no way to eliminate danger entirely. Not when success required the enemy to believe you were a high V-value target. By late August, as Tompkins inflated tanks outside Brest, the unit had completed 5 deception operations. 0 men killed, 18 wounded, all from artillery fire. Random shells, not targeted. Just bad luck being too close to the front. The men knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. Eventually, German intelligence would figure out the pattern, connect the dots, realize that certain American units only appeared at night, only communicated by radio, never actually attacked. When that happened, the Ghost Army would become the target instead of the bait. And rubber tanks don't stop bullets. At Brest, Tompkins watched the morning light spread across his inflatable Shermans. Somewhere, German artillery crews were loading shells, adjusting elevation, preparing to destroy what they thought was an armored battalion. The Ghost Army had created the perfect illusion. Now they had to survive it. On August 25, 1944, at 0600 hours, 8th Corps attacked Fortress Brest. 2nd Infantry Division hit the north. 8th Infantry Division struck the center. 29th Infantry Division pushed from the south. 75,000 American troops against 38,000 Germans. The Ghost Army had done its job. German intelligence reported American tank battalions threatening both flanks. General Romke had repositioned his 88 mm guns. Between 20 and 50 anti-tank weapons now pointed at positions where rubber Shermans had been 12 hours earlier, but Tompkins and Task Force X had already withdrawn. They deflated the tanks at 400, packed them onto trucks, disappeared before the real attack began. Standard procedure: create the illusion, vanish before the enemy realizes they've been fooled. The attack didn't go as planned. Ramke's paratroopers were dug in deeper than intelligence estimated. Bunkers, pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire. The Americans advanced 200 yards in 8 hours, took 300 casualties in the first day. 8th Corps intelligence assessed the Ghost Army's contribution. The repositioned German anti-tank guns had weakened the center. Not enough to break through, but enough to reduce American tank losses. Company D, 709th Tank Battalion, the same real company that had supported Task Force X's deception, reported lighter resistance than expected on the right flank. The deception hadn't won the battle, but it had tilted the odds. Ramke surrendered Brest on September 19th. 27 days of brutal fighting, 10,000 American casualties, the entire German garrison killed or captured. Colonel Rear pulled his unit back to base camp near Les Neven. The men needed rest. Equipment needed maintenance. Inflatable tanks had tiers. Sound equipment needed repairs. Radio operators needed to study new communication patterns. But higher command didn't give them rest. A new mission came in on September 8th, Operation Badenburg. Patton was attacking the fortress city of Metz. His line was dangerously thin. A gap existed between attacking units. If the Germans discovered it and counterattacked, they could cut off an entire American division. The Ghost Army would hold the gap, 100 men pretending to be 15,000. This mission was different from Brest. At Brest, they'd supported a real attack, made the Germans think the American force was larger than it actually was. At Badenburg, they were the only American presence in a critical sector. If Germans probed the line, they'd find actors instead of soldiers. Lieutenant Robert Hiller commanded the sonic operation. His trucks would position just behind the front line, play recordings of tank movements, infantry assembling, artillery being positioned, make the Germans believe a full combat division occupied the gap. The radio deception was even more critical. Signal company operators would mimic an entire division headquarters, generate traffic suggesting battalion movements, supply convoys, reconnaissance patrols, create a complete picture of an active American combat unit. The operation lasted 7 days, September 15th through September 22nd. 1 week of holding empty positions with nothing but sound effects and radio signals. Every night, Hiller's trucks played their recordings, tank engines, officers shouting orders, soldiers singing, all carefully calibrated, loud enough for German listening posts 2 kilometers away. Not loud enough to sound artificial. Every day, radio operators transmitted hundreds of messages, routine traffic, supply requests, patrol reports, all fake, all following exact protocols that real divisions used. German artillery fired sporadic shells into the sector. Not targeted bombardment, just harassment fire, random volleys, the kind you'd send into an occupied position just to keep the enemy nervous. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded during Bettenborg. Shrapnel from 88mm airbursts. They'd been setting up a sonic truck when German artillery opened fire. Pure bad luck. The shells weren't aimed at them specifically, just happened to land close, but the operation succeeded. German reconnaissance didn't discover the gap. Patton's attack continued. By September 22nd, real American units had moved into the sector. The Ghost Army withdrew. Reader reviewed the after-action reports. 2 successful operations, Brittany and Bettenborg. 0 catastrophic failures, 3 dead, 48 wounded. Considering they'd been operating within artillery range for 6 weeks, the casualties were remarkably low. But the men were exhausted. Constant movement, no sleep, living in foxholes, inflating tanks under German observation, playing audio recordings while shells fell, transmitting fake radio traffic knowing German intelligence was listening. The psychological strain was worse than physical danger. Combat soldiers knew their job. Shoot the enemy. Take cover. Advance when ordered. The Ghost Army's job was to be seen, to draw attention, to make themselves targets without fighting back. And the missions were getting harder, more dangerous, closer to the front, higher stakes. In December, they'd face their biggest test yet, the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, and the Ghost Army would play a critical role in stopping it. On December 16, 1944, at 05:30 a.m., German artillery opened fire across a 50-kilometer front in the Ardennes. 29 divisions, 250,000 men. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies. The Ghost Army was in Luxembourg, 60 kilometers from the initial breakthrough, far enough to be safe, close enough to help. Within 12 hours, German tanks had punched through American lines. Entire battalions were surrounded. Communications broke down. Confusion spread. Nobody knew where the Germans are or how far they'd advanced. General Bradley needed information. He needed reserves. Most critically, he needed to prevent German forces from expanding the breakthrough. Every American division was committed. No reserves existed, except the Ghost Army. 1,100 men with inflatable tanks. Bradley's staff proposed Operation Kodak, a radio-only deception. No visual display, no sonic effects, just fake communications suggesting that 2 full divisions were moving into positions south of the breakthrough. The Ghost Army would create phantom reinforcements, make German intelligence believe American reserves were arriving, force Hitler's commanders to divert forces to counter a threat that didn't exist. The mission was extraordinarily dangerous. German forces were advancing. The front line was fluid. Nobody knew where German units actually were. The Ghost Army could stumble into enemy positions while setting up their deception. Radio operators began transmitting on December 19th. They mimicked the 75th Infantry Division and the 6th Armored Division, 2 powerful combat units apparently moving toward Bastogne. The fake 75th transmitted supply requests, unit movement orders, reconnaissance reports, everything aerial division would send while redeploying. Radio operators copied the exact communication style of real operators. The same abbreviations, the same timing patterns, the same operator quirks. The fake 6th Armored sent even more traffic. Tank maintenance reports, fuel requisitions, artillery coordination messages, hundreds of transmissions per day, all suggesting a major armored force preparing to counterattack. German intelligence intercepted everything. Their direction-finding equipment, triangulated transmission sources, plotted unit locations, assessed American strength, and they believed it. German after-action reports mentioned American reinforcements moving south. 2 divisions, exactly what the Ghost Army had simulated. But simulation carried risks. If German commanders believed 2 American divisions were arriving, they might attack those positions preemptively, strike before the reinforcements could organize. Radio operators worked from trucks parked in frozen fields. Temperatures dropped below 0. Equipment malfunctioned. Vacuum tubes shattered in the cold. Men transmitted with frozen fingers, knowing every message made them more visible to German direction-finding equipment. The real battle raged 30 kilometers north. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, running low on ammunition, no resupply, no reinforcements, just orders to hold. Patton was racing north with 3 divisions to break the siege, but he needed time. The Germans had to be confused, delayed, diverted. Operation Kodak provided that delay. German intelligence spent 4 days tracking phantom American divisions, repositioning forces to counter threats that didn't exist. By the time they realized the reinforcements were fake, Patton had already reached Bastogne. The siege broke on December 26th. The 101st was relieved. The German offensive stalled. Hitler's gamble had failed. The Ghost Army's contribution was invisible. No newspaper articles, no medals, no recognition. Radio deception doesn't make good photographs. But Bradley knew, Simpson knew, Patton knew. 1,100 men with radio transmitters had helped save Bastogne. After Operation Kodak, the Ghost Army returned to regular deception missions. Operation Flaxweiler in January, Operation Landvillers in February. Each one more refined, more professional, more dangerous. They'd learned from experience, perfected techniques, understood what worked and what didn't. Visual deception needed good sight lines. Sonic deception needed the right terrain. Radio deception needed perfect timing. But they also understood the cost. Every successful operation meant the next one would be harder. German intelligence was learning too, looking for patterns, asking questions. Why did certain American units only appear at night? Why did some divisions generate radio traffic but never attack? Why did armored battalions disappear without leaving destroyed vehicles? Eventually, German analysts would figure it out, connect the deceptions, realize they'd been systematically fooled 4 months. When that happened, the Ghost Army would become Germany's highest priority target. Every resource would focus on finding them, destroying them, making an example of the men who'd made fools of the Wehrmacht. March 1945 would bring their biggest operation yet, the Rhine crossing, and their closest call with disaster. On March 18, 1945, at 1400 hours, Colonel Rear received orders for Operation Versen. The Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before Germany's industrial heartland. If the crossing failed, the war could drag on for months. The Ghost Army would create the largest deception of the war. Make the Germans believe the crossing would happen at Versen, 15 km north of their crossing site at Rheinberg. This operation required everything: visual deception, sonic deception, radio deception, special effects, the full traveling road show. They had 4 days to prepare, March 18th through March 21st. Set up positions, inflate dummy equipment, create fake supply dumps, string communication wire, position sonic trucks, establish radio networks. The scale was massive. Over 600 inflatable vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, tank destroyers, all positioned where German observation posts could see them, all arranged in realistic tactical formations. Sonic Company would play recordings continuously. Tank movements, construction noise, troop activity, 24 hours per day, making it sound like an entire army was assembling. Radio operators would simulate 2 corps headquarters, dozens of battalion and regimental networks, thousands of transmissions, all suggesting the 9th Army was preparing to cross at Versen. The operation went live on March 21st. German artillery responded immediately. Heavy bombardment, 155mm shells, the largest concentration of fire the Ghost Army had ever experienced. 3 men were wounded in the first hour. Shrapnel tore through a radio truck, equipment destroyed. But the operators kept transmitting, moved to backup positions, continued the deception. German reconnaissance flights increased. Focke-Wulf won the 90s photographing the fake army every 6 hours. The Luftwaffe was paying attention. On March 23rd, the real crossing began at Rheinberg, 15 meters south. Churchill tanks with Fastines, amphibious vehicles, combat engineers under fire. German resistance at Rheinberg was lighter than expected. Intelligence had deployed forces north to counter the threat at Versen. The Ghost Army's fake crossing had pulled defenders away from the real one. The 9th Army established a bridgehead pushed inland. Within 48 hours, they'd crossed 20,000 men. 9th Army commander General William Simpson sent a communication. The Ghost Army's deception had drawn German reserves away from the main effort, saved thousands of lives. But the operation had cost them. Men wounded, more equipment destroyed than in any previous mission. German artillery had targeted their positions for 3 straight days. The men were exhausted, operating continuously since March 18th. No sleep, constant bombardment, working under fire to maintain the illusion. Operation Varen would be their last major deception. 3 weeks later, Germany would surrender. The war in Europe would end. But in late March, nobody knew that. The Ghost Army prepared for more missions, more deceptions, more nights inflating tanks while artillery fell. They'd perform 21 operations. France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany fooled Hitler's intelligence services repeatedly, saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives, and nobody knew they existed. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The E-Day, the war in Europe, was over. The Ghost Army had survived. Final tally: 21 deception operations, 3 men killed, 48 wounded, 0 catastrophic failures. Every mission had succeeded at some level, some spectacularly, others marginally, but none had been completely exposed. Colonel Rear assembled the unit on May 10th, 1,100 men in a field near Luxembourg. He told them what would happen next. Their records would be classified, all documentation sealed, equipment destroyed or locked away. The men would be sworn to secrecy. Nobody could discuss their missions. Not with family, not with other veterans, not with anyone. The reason was simple. The techniques they developed were too valuable. Inflatable deception, sonic warfare, radio manipulation. The Army wanted to preserve these methods for future conflicts. The men signed secrecy agreements. Violation meant court-martial. They couldn't even admit they'd served in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. If anyone asked, they'd served in regular combat units. The unit officially disbanded on June 23rd, exactly 1 year after arriving in France. The men shipped home on the USS General O. Ernst. 13 days crossing the Atlantic. The same journey in reverse. Most returned to civilian life immediately. Artists went back to art. Engineers, tow engineering. Fashion designer Bill Blass returned to New York. Painter Ellsworth Kelly to Paris. Photographer Art C.A. to magazines. They couldn't talk about what they'd done. Couldn't explain the gap in their service records. At reunions with other veterans, they'd listen to war stories, tank battles, infantry assaults, but they couldn't share their own. Bob Tompkins returned to his family, told them he'd served with an engineering unit in France. Nothing specific, nothing classified. His diary, written in violation of security regulations, went into a box, hidden. The secrecy lasted 50 years. In 1996, the Pentagon declassified the Ghost Army records. Researchers finally accessed the files, discovered the full story. Rick Beyer, a filmmaker, found the documentation, interviewed surviving veterans, produced a PBS documentary in 2013. The Ghost Army finally became public knowledge. But by then, most of the men were dead. They'd carried the secret their entire lives, died without recognition, without anyone knowing what they'd accomplished. In 2024, 79 years after the war ended, Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor. 3 surviving veterans attended the ceremony: Seymour Neusenbaum, John Chrisman, Bernard Bluestein, all over 95 years old. Senator Edward Markey said the soldiers recruited for the Ghost Army were not only men of muscle, they were also men of the mind. But most of the 1,100 men never received any recognition. They'd saved thousands of lives, changed the outcome of major battles, helped win the war, and they'd done it in complete silence. The techniques they developed are still classified. Modern militaries use similar methods: inflatable decoys, electronic warfare, deception operations, all descended from what 1,100 artists and engineers invented in 1944. The Ghost Army proved something fundamental about warfare. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't firepower, it's creativity. The Ghost Army left behind one final mystery. How many lives did they actually save? Military historians have debated this for decades. Conservative estimates say 15,000. Optimistic estimates say 30,000. The truth is probably somewhere between. At Brest, German anti-tank guns repositioned away from the main attack. American tank losses were lower than expected. How many tankers survived because of rubber Shermans? Impossible to calculate precisely. At Beststone, Operation Kodak delayed German forces for 4 critical days. Patton reached the surrounded 101st Airborne just in time. If the Germans hadn't been distracted by phantom divisions, would Bastogne have fallen? Would thousands more have died? At the Rhine crossing, the 9th Army faced lighter resistance because defenders had moved north. How many soldiers crossed the river because German forces were 15 kilometers away, chasing inflatable tanks? The Ghost Army's weapon was deception. And deception doesn't leave casualty counts. It leaves mystery. But the men who served understood the reality. Every successful ruse meant fewer American soldiers facing German fire. Every artillery gun diverted to engage phantom targets was one less cannon threatening real troops. Bob Tompkins passed away in 2003. His daughter discovered his diary while clearing out his home, a small notebook he'd carried in violation of security rules. Inside were sketches of inflatable tanks, observations about German lookout posts, and records of operations that were meant to stay classified forever. James Anderson, the Virginia mechanic who made artificial tank tracks with a bulldozer, lived until 2018, 94 years old. He gave a single interview before his death, saying the strangest part wasn't the danger, it was the silence, keeping a secret for 7 decades. The last surviving piece of Ghost Army equipment, an inflatable Sherman tank, is exhibited at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. 93 pounds of rubber that helped win a war. They fought without firing, deceived without betraying their own command, and saved lives by risking theirs. And they did it all in utter silence. If this story touched you, hit that like button now. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We recover forgotten war tales every week. Real soldiers, real valor, real history. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Texas, Germany, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and tell us if anyone in your family served in World War II. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, what theater? Europe or the Pacific? If you're a veteran yourself, from any conflict, any branch, thank you. Share your story in the comments. Our community spans the entire globe. You're not just watching, you're helping preserve these memories. Thank you for ensuring the Ghost Army doesn't fade into silence. These men deserve to be honored. And you're helping make that happen. Make that happen.